You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Thursday evening, folks. Welcome to my program, the Intrepid radio program, with me, your host, Scotty Roberts, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. And you can join this broadcast as well in simulcast, in video, over on my YouTube channel. And that is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over, join the Intrepids over in the chat room and talk about the show or just about anything else you want. And so glad to have you here with me tonight. And there's all kinds of things that I have up in front of me for tonight's show. I promised yesterday I wanted to talk about the Cathars tonight. I'll bet some of you don't even know who they were. I didn't know who they were for the longest time, even though they are part of, really, church history. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. I do want to make mention of something that I spoke about yesterday, which was the State of the Union address and all the snubs that were going back and forth. It was said that Nancy Pelosi didn't announce Trump correctly, snub number one. Snub number two, Trump ignored her handshake and did not shake her hand. Snub number three, Nancy tore her copy of the State of the Union address in pieces at the end of the address. Now, it's interesting because some people have been doing some looking into this. Watching the video, number one, the first thing that is noticed is that Trump did not snub Nancy Pelosi's offered handshake. What happened was he handed a copy to the vice president of the speech. He handed a copy to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and turned immediately toward the podium as she extended her hand. If you take close scrutiny, for what it matters, folks, only because everybody capitalizes on all the little shit out there, he was turned away and did not see her extended hand, nor did he shake the vice president's hand. So Trump came up, delivered the two copies, turned to the podium, missed her extended hand. He did not snub her. He just didn't shake anybody's hand up there. And Vice President Pence has not made a big deal about him snubbing him. So Nancy Pelosi was not snubbed by President Trump. Furthermore, about 30 minutes in, and there is video footage of this now, and we've seen some close-ups being done, zooming in to check this out. Nancy Pelosi, about 30 minutes into the speech, was taking those big pieces of cardstock that the speech was written on and lowered it down a little bit below the desk level, but you could see it, and she was ripping little notches in each page so she could come back later and tear them easily on camera. Her action of snubbing the president with the tearing of the documents was completely premeditated. So it was something she planned to do. And she was not snubbed by the president. So there you go. There's just a little update on that. You can follow that stuff if you want. That's politics. That's the way that stuff rolls. But I think it's important with all the demonization of Trump that is out there already. It's an important feature to point out that he did not snub Nancy Pelosi. And she was the only one doing snubbing during the speech. So there you go. If it's important to you, there it is. It's not a huge important issue other than I keep hearing on the news as I drive or as I'm listening while I'm working that the president, after he snubbed Nancy Pelosi's handshake, I heard that just an hour ago. And I thought, people must not be aware of that. If it's going to be promulgated as something he did, let's at least get the facts straight. Boom. Enough of that. Now, I want to move on to what we're going to talk about tonight. Going to talk about the Cathars. Now, I think about the only personalized lesson internal lesson you can take from this is looking at, if you come from Western Christianity, you're going to look at some of the things that the Western Church did. And it started in those initial first couple of centuries before the Orthodox Church had its foothold. By the time it did, it was already persecuting those who believed differently than they did, than what the church hierarchy was teaching, namely the Gnostics and the mystics. And the Cathars rose up in the Dark Ages, maybe more the Middle Ages. And I want to look into this a little bit. And some of this there is a little personal twist on this that got me looking into it. Although I had crossed over this material and wanted to talk about it, our own Amanda B. over in the chat room. Just want to say hey to her. The Cathars is something that is near and dear to her heart, as some of her forebears came from this tradition. And so if there's any dedicating to do, I'll dedicate tonight's show to her. And it's more, call it a little bit of a history lesson, a little bit of a church history lesson, because I want us all to understand some of the things that went on behind the scenes, not even behind the scenes, I don't even know where that came from. Some of the things that went on in history with the Orthodox Catholic Church, the literalist church, as we redefined them during our examination of them over the last few weeks. And so the Cathars, they were also known as the Cathari, from the Greek word katharoi, Catharoi, Katharoi, the Cathari. That meant pure ones. They were kind of this dualist medieval religious sect of southern France, which flourished in the 12th century of the Common Era. And they challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, which was a very dangerous thing to do at that time. Because remember, what had the church become over the previous 1,000 years before 1200? They had become an organization that was willing to show that they would kill, maim, torture anybody who did not believe in the love of Jesus the way they taught it. And so these folks, the Cathars, they were also known as the Albigensians, from the town of Albi, which was a strong Cathar center of belief. And the Cathar priests lived simply. They had no possessions. They imposed no taxes, no penalties. They regarded men and women as equals. Aspects of the faith which appealed to many at the time that were disillusioned with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the Cathar beliefs ultimately derived from the Persian religion of Manichaeism, but directly from another earlier religious sect from Bulgaria known as the Bogomils, who blended Manichaeism with Christianity. And so in these early days, just like the Gnostic mystics, there was an earlier form of Christianity that existed prior to the time of the literalist Orthodox Roman Catholic Church. And they were blending some of these traditions. The Cathars believed that Satan had tricked a number of angels into falling from heaven and then encased them in bodies. And the purpose of life was to renounce the pleasures and the enticements of the world, and through repeated incarnations, make one's way back to heaven. And to this end, the Cathars observed a strict hierarchy. The perfecti, those who had renounced the world, the priests, the bishops, the credentes, the believers who still interacted with the world but worked toward renunciation, and the sympathizers, non-believers who aided and supported Cathar communities. That's how the Cathars viewed the people around them. Now, the Cathars rejected the teachings of the Catholic Church, and they saw them as being immoral. The hierarchy of the Catholic Church is being immoral. And most of the books of the Bible is inspired by Satan. This is what the Cathars believed. They criticized the church heavily for the hypocrisy, the greed, the lechery of its clergy and the church's acquisition of land and wealth. This is what the church had become. A growing, remember I said yesterday, the Roman Catholic Church at this time and prior to it had become like a nation unto itself. It had its own standing army that fought for the Pope. They acquired possessions. They acquired land. And they increased their net worth. And many times it was because the Inquisition, in taking down, I was looking for a good phrase for that, taking down heretics, their land and their possessions became the land and the possessions of the Catholic Church. And not surprisingly, the Cathars were condemned by the Roman Catholic Church as heretical, and they were massacred. There was the Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, for 20 years, which devastated the towns, the cities, and the cultures of southern France. And this was the persecution, the brutality of the Roman Catholic Church against those who would deign to think otherwise. And almost everything known about the Cathars comes from confessions of heretics that were taken by the Catholic clergy during the Inquisition, which followed the Albigensian Crusade. The belief structure can be easily tracked back to Manichaeism, which traveled via the Silk Road from the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Silk Road, John Ward and I almost did a book on the Silk Road from China, the trade routes and all the towns and the cities on the way, all the belief systems, everything that was going on. Very interesting period of time when that was at its height. But they believe that the religion came to France via the Silk Road from the Byzantine Empire in the Middle East to Europe, where it became entwined under certain circumstances with Christian belief and symbolism. Excuse me. The Orthodox view of the Catholic Church was that there was one God with three aspects, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But this orthodoxy was not part of the vision of the early Christianity. As we've already covered many times, this was not how early Christianity believed. But this orthodoxy is what it became. This literalist orthodoxy of the Roman Catholic Church, what became the Roman Catholic Church. And this orthodoxy was not part of the vision of the early Christianity, and it was not generally accepted until after the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, convened by Constantine. He was the first Christian emperor of Rome, as we've talked about, and he also made himself the Pope, the first Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. And he ruled in favor of it. And even then, the Nicene interpretations of Christianity vied with others for centuries. And the so-called heretical movements of the Middle Ages, such as the Bogomils, the Cathars, the Waldensians, these were all simply the latest challenges to the Church after the Gnostic mysticisms. And they were significant because they were the first to set themselves up as a legitimate alternative to Catholicism in any form, in Europe especially. Now, the Cathar beliefs included these. Now, I think these are really interesting. Cathar beliefs, they had a recognition of the feminine principle of the divine. God was both male and female. The female aspect of God was Sophia, or wisdom. This belief encouraged equality of the sexes in the Cathar communities, which was absolutely forbidden in the literalist Orthodox Roman Catholic Church. And remember Sophia and wisdom. Jesus spoke of getting wisdom. Sophia was the embodiment of wisdom in first century Judea and prior to that. And so this was what they believed. They recognized both the male and female aspects of God. And if you remember, we talked about the Shekinah glory. When Moses in the desert, after the Exodus, they built the tabernacle of the covenant, the tent version of what would become the temple in Jerusalem, and that God's Shekinah glory descended out of heaven like a cloud, and settled on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, in the Holy of Holies, in the tabernacle. And the mercy seat being where between the wings of the cherub on top of the Ark of the Covenant. And Shekinah is strictly a female genderic term in Hebrew. So the female presence of God, it says in the Old Testament. But we were never taught that. So the Cathars recognized this. Metempsychosis, or reincarnation, was another thing that the Cathars believed. A soul would be continually reborn until it renounced the world completely and escaped incarnation. Cosmic duality, the existence of two powerful deities in the universe, one good, one evil, who were in a constant state of war. And the purpose of life was to serve the good by serving others and escape the cycle of rebirth and death to return home to God. Now, I know in Christian theology that when I went to seminary, when I was in Christian theology, God and Satan were never equal counterparts. They were not yin and yang. God was the creator of Satan, and thereby Satan was subservient to him, and God in the prophecies would someday condemn him and he would go to hell. So the Cathars believed a bit different than that. The Cathars were vegetarians, vegetarianism, though eating fish was allowed because to credentes and sympathizers, because they were deemed an inferior animal. So there you go. They believed in celibacy for the perfecti, the celibate or the prefects. Celibacy was also encouraged generally, since it was thought that every person born was just another poor soul trapped by the devil in a body. Marriage overall was discouraged. So I don't know if they had sex, these Cathars, but they must have encouraged it outside the bonds of marriage if they did at all. Now that's just that's a speculation on my part. It's not history. So the dignity of manual labor. The Cathars all worked, priests as well as lay people, many as weavers. I think were not the Cathars closely associated later with the Mercers, which were the wool producers in Europe? I'm not sure. Got to look into that. So suicide, known as the ritual of Endura, as a rational and dignified response under certain conditions, was also a belief of the Cathars. So earlier heresies such as Arianism, while still condemned, at least adhered to the same essential dogma of the church. The Cathars rejected and repudiated every aspect of the Roman Catholic Church, including most of the books of the Bible. Scholar Malcolm Barber noted this: the Cathars believed that the devil was the author of the Old Testament, except these books: Job, the Psalms, the Book of Solomon, books of Solomon, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, and the book of Jesus, son of Sirach, better known as the book of Ecclesiasticus, of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the 12 prophets. So that's what the Cathars believed. And they had a book of two principles, and we're running a little tight on this time, so we may spill over into the next segment with this. But the only books of the New Testament that the Cathars accepted were the Gospels, completely rejecting the epistles of Paul, the apostle, and the others, with a special emphasis on the Gospel according to John. Their central religious text was the Book of Two Principles, passages of which would be read by one of the prefecti in the congregation and interpreted for them by another member of the group. So the Book of Two Principles related, among other aspects of the faith, the dualist nature of life and how humans, once divine spirits of light, came to be bound in corruptible mortal flesh. Now the story goes that the devil came to the gates of heaven and requested entry, but was denied. He waited outside the gate for 1,000 years, watching for a chance to slip in, and one day he saw his opportunity and he took it. Once inside, he gathered an audience of divine spirits around him and told them they were losing out by continuing to love and serve God, who never gave them anything. And they were little more than slaves, he said, since God owned everything they thought they had. And if they would follow him, the devil, however, and leave heaven, he would provide them with all kinds of pleasure, such as lovely vineyards, rich fields, beautiful women, handsome men, wonderful riches, and the very best of wines. And we're going to pick up that story because it's too long here, but I'll leave you with this thought on the end of the first segment here. The Cathars repudiated the symbol of the cross and a literal reading of any of the biblical books. So, folks, we're taking a look at the Cathars tonight. We got to go out to break. We've gone for 2 minutes. Sit tight. We'll be right back. All right, folks, thanks for sitting on through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, ODYSY1.com, and you can come and watch the simulcast over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. I want to make a couple of little announcements here. First of all, I do tarot readings. Come over to my site, scottallenroberts.com. Click on the tarot link, and you'll find a couple of places where you can purchase 5-card and 10-card readings. Go ahead and make a PayPal payment. Contact me. We'll get you on the schedule. Also, you can see right here on my YouTube channel, you'll find on my main page, on the header, lower right-hand corner of the header, donate to my continued research. You can sign up there for tarot readings. There's no price structure there, so you can throw in $45 or $85 for the tarot readings, and we'll get it figured out. Or you can just donate to my further research. I don't announce that very often. I don't want it to sound self-serving, but there it is. Also, little announcement, this coming Sunday, the 9th of February, I am going to be, some of you may remember that I took a little trip down to Key West, down in the Caribbean this couple of months ago now. And I couldn't, because I signed non-disclosure, tell what that was all about, other than to say I was working on a little TV series. Now, I'm not one of the main people on the show, but I was a talking head on a show which I can now announce. It's going to be The Curse of the Bermuda Triangle. And this show, I think, is a very fresh approach to the Bermuda Triangle, scientific methodology applied, and all of that. And I met the two main heads of this show and spent a whole day filming with them. There's only 8 episodes that have been approved for this first season. They premiere on Sunday the 9th on the Science Channel. I think you're going to be able to find them on Amazon as well. But if you look up Curse of the Bermuda Triangle Science Channel, you're going to find the schedule. If you go over to my Facebook page, you'll see I've posted it up over there. And I'm in at least 3 of the episodes, I've been told. I don't even know if I'll be in the first one. I'll find out, though, and I'll announce that. But Sunday night begins that show, and I'm one of the talking heads with a small part on that show, but it was a hell of a lot of fun. So come on over and take a look at it. All right, folks, let's move back into the Cathars. And what do we got here? We've got full time. Sometimes I talk and I just totally lose track of the time. So we're way good for time because we're still at the beginning here. So let's go. We were in this story of how the devil came to the gates of heaven and he tempted people to come away with him, promising them riches and wine and men and women and so on. Now many souls were seduced, and for 9 days and 9 nights they fell through the hole in heaven the devil had created. God allowed for this for those who wished to leave, but other souls were falling through the hole as well, and so God sealed it up. And after the souls had fallen, they found themselves in the devil's realm without any of the good things he had promised. And remembering the joys of heaven, they repented and asked the devil if they could return. The devil replied that they could not, because he had fashioned for them bodies, which would bind them to earth and cause them to forget all about heaven. And by the way, this is from the Book of Two Principles, which is one of the scriptural books at the Cathars, raised to the level of Scripture. Now, the devil made the bodies easily enough, but he couldn't manage to attach the souls to them. So they would think, feel, move, and vexed by this, he asked God for help. God understood that the souls who had fallen would have to work their way back to his grace, and that they could do so through struggling with these bodies. So he made a deal with the devil. The devil could do as he liked with the bodies, but the souls which animated them belonged to God. The devil consented, and the humans were created. And so, trapped in these bodies, the soul would live, die, be reborn in another as long as that soul remained attached to the body and the pleasures which the devil had promised it back in heaven. And once the soul renounced the body and all its temptations, it would be freed to return to God and resume its former state. Now, the whole purpose of human existence was this struggle against the devil, known as Rex Mundi, the king of this world, and the prison of the flesh. This is one of the main beliefs of the Cathars. Now, they, of course, because of this and many other things, found themselves in conflict with the church. Now, this view contrasted sharply with the church's vision of a Garden of Eden, in which the woman, in the form of Eve, had caused humanity's fall by seducing Adam into eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and of humanity's later redemption from sin through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, the Son of the single, all-powerful male God. Suicide was and is still considered a serious sin by the Roman Catholic Church. Marriage is encouraged, reincarnation rejected, as is the concept of duality. And so in Catharism, God and the devil are two eternal, uncreated forces of equal power. In Christianity, the devil is a fallen angel, created by God and ultimately subordinate to him. There's some of the major differences between Christianity and Catharism. And now, in addition to these differences, there was the Cathar insistence that Jesus had never been born of a woman and been made flesh. never suffered, never died, and was therefore never resurrected. All these events, as told in the gospel narratives, happened ideally as a sort of allegory for the state of the soul, which is born into the world trapped in a body, must suffer and die, and will finally be free only after it has mastered the body and renounced the things of this world. Now, I will say that I tend to have a very firm belief, tend is the wrong word, I have a very firm belief that Jesus existed as a historical person. I believe that he is the subject in the Gospels, but I also believe, as we have covered prior to this, we've talked about how I think the Gospels are in error in many places. And I think they have taken the mythology of what Jesus was supposed to represent and made it the literalist vision of what Jesus was supposed to represent. And of course, the literalists won out, the Orthodox Church. And that's why we have Christianity as we have it today. But it didn't exist that way, as we've mentioned even several times in this episode, for at least the first 2.5 centuries after the time of Jesus. The Cathars, therefore, repudiated the symbol of the cross and a literal reading of any of the biblical books. They considered the cross the symbol of Rex Mundi, the king of this world, Satan. And they believed that it should be destroyed when encountered, as it was a representation of evil, according to the Cathars. If you wore a cross around your neck, or gothy cross earrings, or belt buckles, from down in Texas, you got your big old belt buckle with the cross of Jesus on it, those were the things that the Cathars would destroy if they found them. They thought it was a representation of evil. Evil. And the cross, they claimed, was nothing more than a symbol of worldly power, and all the sacraments of the church, including infant baptism and communion, were likewise rejected. The Cathars, who were not celibate, practiced birth control and abortion, believing that sex was a natural aspect of the human condition. Bada boom! I told you, my speculation wasn't that far off. And it could be engaged in for, horror of horrors, pleasure. Excuse me. Which is something the Roman Catholic Church and the papal edicts said you could not do. Sex wasn't for pleasure, it was for reproduction. And of course we know the church's stance on, Orthodox Church's stance on birth control, abortion, and things like that. So the Cathars believed that sex was a natural aspect of the human condition. It could be engaged in for fun and pleasure, but not just for procreation. In fact, procreation was actually discouraged, remember? Women were valued as men's equals, and female figures from the Bible were highlighted, especially Mary Magdalene and the Virgin Mary. Some scholars have suggested, in fact, that the growth of the cult of the Virgin Mary in medieval Europe, which became an increasingly popular and influential movement, was encouraged by the Cathars' elevation of womanhood. And keep in mind, remember, they discouraged reproduction, the Cathars. So they would be against, while for sexual activity, having fun and enjoying it and pleasure, they were against reproducing, because they believe every human being that reproduced was another body that could inhabit a soul that Satan had stolen. So the Cathars lived in communities which varied in size from about 60 to 600 people. They shared their possessions. They took care of each other as a family. The faith gained a strong foothold in Italy and southern France through its appeal to the peasantry. Scholar Martin Erbstosser notes that, quote, it was the life of the prefecte rather than the teachings of the heretics which played the key part here. The prefecti, if you remember now, they lived such blameless lives and were so eager to be of assistance to others that they inspired devoted followers. Now, isn't that the truth? If you see a leader who is going to be somebody who inspires you to give of yourself to others, and for all of you to muck in together. And you know what? That inspires people to follow you. And so the faith did not remain restricted to the peasantry for very long, but it spread up the medieval hierarchy to artisans like weavers, potters, writers, poets, merchants, and business owners, members of the Catholic clergy, and finally nobility. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived in the early to the mid, all through the 1200s, let's put it that way, 1100s, 1122 to 1204. There, I've spent so much time just correcting my date. And her daughter, Marie de Champagne, were both associated with the Cathars as sympathizers. Eleanor of Aquitaine. And the Cathars dressed simply in dark robes with hoods or hats. They went about barefoot. The men were unshaven with long beards. They appear in small numbers in records from the 1140s in France, but by 1167, there were enough communities in the region to require an assembly to set rules and boundaries. The Council of St. Felix of 1167, organized by the Cathar communities into bishoprics, each with a presiding bishop who was responsible only to his own flock. There was no central authority like the Pope of Rome. The council was presided over by a Bogomil cleric named Nicetas, which firmly establishes the Bogomilism as the direct source of Catharism. Okay, to become a Cathar, one simply professed one's belief, received the consolamentum, a blessing and a welcoming to the faith through the laying on of hands. To become one of the perfecti, one completely renounced the world and went through a period of withdrawal and purification before taking office. Men and women were perfecti. There were no official services or masses, as with the church, but rather informal gatherings, which seem to have been in adherents' homes. In southern France, where the church had never had a very strong hold, Cathars lived and worked among the wider community. They convened their gatherings without concern. Elsewhere, they had to be more careful and hide their faith, and this practice, according to some scholars, gave birth to the most popular literary genre of the Middle Ages, the poetry of courtly love. Believe it or not, really found its source in the Cathars. Courtly love poetry developed in southern France at and then that figure, it's the French, mais oui, ma chérie, les morts, and so on. But love poetry developed in southern France at the same time as the Cathar heresy. The common theme of this body of medieval literature is the beautiful woman who commands worship and service by a courteous, brave, and noble knight. The famous literary motif of the damsel in distress who must be rescued comes from this genre, and its most famous author was the French poet Chrétien de Troyes, whose patroness was Marie de Champagne. And Chrétien is best known for creating some of the most famous elements of the Arthurian legend, such as Lancelot's affair with Arthur's queen Guinevere, the quest for the Grail, and is the first to call Arthur's court Camelot. And the poems often involve a quest or some struggle to find or rescue a lady who'd been abducted or imprisoned. Women frequently play important roles in these stories, and in a reversal of earlier medieval literary motifs are the central characters who are served by men, rather than the minor figures and men's property. And so most importantly, the poems that they wrote celebrated romantic love, which was considered quite different and far superior to marriage, because in marriage, the couple had no choice. The match was arranged by parents, and while one chose to engage in extramarital or premarital love affairs, this is what the poetry seem to, under the Cathars' beliefs, celebrate. I have to say this too, in talking about Camelot and the Arthurian legends, I remember I had a copy of the original script of Camelot, and it's around here somewhere, for the Broadway play, which was Richard Burton and Julie Andrews back during the time of the Kennedy administration. That's why they kept referring to the Kennedys as the time of Camelot in U.S. politics. But there was a line, and speaking of the beauty of the Cathar poetry, this line was an adaptation, but it was where Arthur had his soliloquy. They call it the Excalibur soliloquy, where he's all alone and he's about to go knight Lancelot, but he's found that they have been unfaithful to him, his wife Guinevere and Lancelot. And he's trying to sort this out in his head because he loves them both. And he says these words, and let's see if I can remember them. He says, proposition. He says, of all the women who move on the face of this earth, the face I would most love, and he lists all these qualities, from her love, her touch, her soul, down her hair, down to the very life itself. They would all be Jenny's. He speaks of his wife. This is the romanticism that grew out of the Cathars. And of course, in that soliloquy, he talks about Lancelot, and he says, proposition of all the men who dwell on the face of this earth, who would I choose to be the man I would most love, for my friend, for my brother? And all of these things, he said, they would all be Lance. And he said, yes, I love them. I love them, despite the fact that they do me harm. And that's where he goes on to resolve in this. He says, we shall get through this. We'll live through this, Excalibur. They, you and I, and may God have mercy on our souls. And, or God bless us all, I think he said. This is the time of King Arthur, the time when we reach for the stars, if you remember that soliloquy. All of that comes to mind, that the Cathars are really the beginnings of this kind of romantic poetry that led to this kind of writing. The scholar C.S. Lewis, he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. He points out how in the modern day, these themes seem commonplace, these love poems and love writing and so on, and far from surprising. But if one compares the poetry of 12th century Provence with works like Bede's History of Beowulf, one realizes what a startling departure it was. And so Lewis and others cite Catharism as the probable inspiration for these works, and claims that they were allegories of the Cathar vision. The damsel in distress was the feminine principle of God, Sophia, who had been abducted by the Catholic Church, and the brave knight was the Cathar adherent who loved, served, and was sworn to rescue her. According to this theory, Catharism spread widely and quickly as it did through the troubadours who traveled through France performing these works. So you see, the love poems that they wrote, all these stories were the embodiment, they were allegorical pictures of what they believed. And this is how they spread the word of what they believed throughout all of Europe. And we still have tendrils of that today because it's become commonplace now. So, let's move on a little bit from that. The Albigensian Crusade, and whether the poetry of the Cathars was religious allegory, helping spread the faith, or whether the Cathars simply provided a better alternative to the corrupt and power-hungry medieval church, by the late 12th century, Catharism was winning more adherents than ever. Papal legates had been sent to southern France to try to win the heretics back to orthodoxy. Could you imagine having that kind of a lifestyle, the beliefs that the Cathars held, then having the church come back, the Orthodox literalist church, come to you and try to persuade you to come home. Leave your heresy behind. I don't think there was any contest in the minds of common folk. And so they sent all these legates to southern France to try to win them all back to orthodoxy. And councils had been called to discuss the problem. But none of these efforts made any headway to win back over the people who had converted to Catharism. So in 1208, Pope Innocent III sent the lawyer-monk Pierre de Castelnau to southern France to enlist the aid of Raymond VI, the Count of Toulouse, and in suppressing heresy. Raymond was not only an ardent protector and supporter of the Cathars, but also the bishop of the Order of Toulouse. And you know what? He flatly refused to cooperate with the Pope's legate, and he sent him packing. And Castelnau was later found murdered. Castelnau, by the way. It's Castelnau. Castelnau. Now, Pope Innocent, so they murdered him because he wouldn't help. He was a big supporter and protector of the Cathars. Pope Innocent then called for a crusade against southern France, promising the nobles of the north that they could keep all the rich lands and booty of their southern neighbors after the Cathars had been killed and their supporters crushed. So they bribed the northern kingdoms in France, these northern rulers, by saying you can have all their land, all in an effort for the Catholic Church to crush a group of people that didn't agree with them, that wanted to live their lives in a different way than what the Church ordained. And so the northern nobles were only too happy to comply with the Pope's holy wishes. They wanted the land, beautiful land, wonderful land. And the Albigensian Crusade was launched in 1209. Now, since the majority of the Cathars were women, it was mainly women and children who were massacred in this crusade. But often, whole towns went up in flames, and all the citizenry were killed, and at the siege turned massacre of the town of Béziers, when Arnaud d'Amore, the Cistercian monk commanding the church's forces, was asked how to tell the difference between a heretic and a believer, he said, "Kill them all, the Lord knows who are his." And so according to the church documents, 20,000 heretics, Cathars, and some of the church's own people were slaughtered in and around Béziers, and the town was burned to the ground. And after 1209, the sack of Carcassonne, the Earl Simon de Montfort led the crusade which continued the destruction of the region while enriching the northern barons who participated. And by 1229, the official crusade was over. But the Cathars were still persecuted, and northern armies continued to sack villages and murder innocent people. And between May of 1243 and March of 1244, the Cathar stronghold of Montségur held against siege, but was finally taken, and the last Cathar defense fell to the Orthodox Roman Catholic Church and their armies. In the massacre which followed, 200 perfecti were burned alive, all on a large pyre. So there you go. There's probably more to say about the Cathars, but we're out of time. Maybe we'll pick some of this up tomorrow and give you a little further history on them. But there you go. That was a totally different view of Cathars and the way they viewed Christianity in the medieval times. So we got to go, folks. Thanks for listening. 23-hour break. We'll see you right back here tomorrow. Sit tight. Have a good night.